Our goal with miniature painting is always to make this miniature in front of us look good. We want others to look at the piece and say, wow, I really like it. And the good news is, all we have to do for that is to make our miniatures look normal. Easy, right? But what does that mean? To make something look good means to make it credible to the eye, or to be more precisely to our brains. We get weary if we look at something that doesn't make sense and it doesn't feel normal and out of place. So what we need to do is to create something that appears right to our brain and create it the way we would expect a representation of something in miniature form to look. We're not talking about perfect blends, fancy techniques, dual light sources and OSL. No, we're talking about putting the right amount of shadows and the right amount of lights on a miniature. And when I say the right amount, as always, that means a credible amount. Say goodbye to the concepts of correct and right, because those concepts convey the idea of perfection and give the false impression that there is one true way in miniature painting. But no, there's multiple ways to make miniatures credible, and that is the reason why a lot of styles work. There's no need to stress out over perfection, as we already established in earlier videos. Credible is all you need. So how does contrast tie in here? Like I said, we need to make our miniatures look normal to the eye. Now these miniatures are representations of something that is roughly 180 centimeters, 2 meters or 3 meters high, and we have a certain expectation of how much shadow is cast on the features of a person, a robot, a monster, anything really in real life, and where and how much light appears on it as well. Which means we have to copy exactly this onto our miniatures that are just 28 millimeters or 75 millimeters high, or 1 to 10 busts, or whatever you're painting. The shadows these tiny features cast are not enough, and we have to exaggerate with paints. This gets evident if you shrink down pictures of real people to a size closer to actual miniature size. Very large pieces like 1 to 4 scale sideshow collectibles can get away with less focus on this and just one coat paint jobs, but the small scales look weird and off if there's not enough value contrast. Adding a simple wash increased the looks of this miniature by a lot, and we actually want to look at it while we don't really want to look at the version on the left. Our gaze always gets drawn to what we perceive as real first, and a real person especially. This is the reason why just plain black and white zenithal primed miniatures look surprisingly pleasing. Hard lights and shadows like these we can only reproduce if we put a light source right above the miniature in an unprimed state. Under normal global light, we will simply not get intense shadows like that. In reality, all these features are bigger and would cast harder and bigger shadows, and our brain is looking for that. So what we are doing when we are maximizing contrast is emulating realism and mimicking how light would interact with the true real life thing. In short, we are simulating an in-scale light source. And we're trying to paint this miniature as if it would exist in its true scale. To make it more complicated, there is a lot of different kinds of contrasts we can use to create a mood or draw attention to certain areas of miniatures, but let's start simple. The first form of contrast we want to focus on is also the most important, which is value contrast. So the difference of darkest value of shadow and the lightest value of highlight. Something I always recommend to beginner painters is contrast first, smoothness later. This has two meanings. The first meaning is a literal one, as you can see on the shield. First I build the contrast, that means I'm adding in a brighter, opaque layer of color instead of just mixing an incrementally lighter color than the base layer and repeat that 15 times. What I'm doing here is I'm blocking in the bright areas and I work on the transitions later. This helps a lot because you already have bright, strong, saturated color tones on your highlight areas, which isn't always that easy when you have to paint 12 layers because you want the perfect transition. The second meaning of contrast first, smoothness later is referring to a mindset. It is way more important if you want a great result to have strong contrast on a miniature than smooth blendings. And coincidentally, it is also easier to do early on. So this is actually a shortcut in a way to get interesting results, to see quick progress in your skills and results, while trying to get smooth blends involves a lot more practice, brush control, and other knowledge before you will see satisfying results. Don't stress about smoothness, it might just discourage you. If you have the desire to push your contrast and you're not used to it, it is going to be something new that you consciously have to focus on doing. And that cognitive load will interfere with other aspects, for example, smoothness, and that is fine. The thing is, even if you are focusing on contrast, you're still painting, you're gaining experience, you learn how the paint behaves, and you learn how to control your brush. And in no time you will be experimenting with more diluted layers and getting transitions smoother anyway. When we are dealing with small surfaces, it is way easier to put down a base color, a sharp highlight, and then work on a transition, instead of trying to cram 15 layers into the same space and not screw up the transition by covering too much or mixing in too much highlight color too quickly and then not having enough room to correct it. Here you can see that I don't care much about smoothness. I want to put down a visible layer of paint and there is simply no room to blend. The area is so small that it won't matter. When pushing contrast, it is almost always a trade-off with smoothness. Here, using white for example on the face of my orc, you can see that the blending from white to the medium color is pretty rough. But there's good news, we can do a few things to avoid this, but more on that later. Just keep in mind again that aiming for contrast and smoothness needs a lot of knowledge, experience and practice, and if you're starting out, you should in my opinion focus on contrast. Contrast helps to make your miniatures readable. It distinguishes parts from each other and within themselves. Having light areas next to dark areas makes our miniatures better readable. Of course you could choose dark colors on every part of a miniature to make an artistic point, but for the sake of being able to skim over the miniature and seeing what is going on, alternate bright and dark areas are important. If there's trims around bright armor parts, make them dark, like I did here for example, or paint bright trims for dark armor. It will break up the monotony and make each panel identifiable more easily. On the other hand, if you have a panel, always outline it and put some dark areas and some bright areas there. That's what I mean by distinguish it within itself. Something you always want to do is put light next to dark, and that has two meanings again. The first meaning is putting bright and dark areas into the single elements will make the details stand out more, up to the point where we want to exaggerate by putting a bright line next to a dark one, and it will help our eyes to make out shapes immediately. The second meaning is a bright element next to a dark element distinguishes an area from the other and can also make us focus on certain elements that we want the viewer to see first. Perception of value is determined by the values of surrounding colors. These squares in the middle are the same value of gray, but putting the left one on a dark square makes it appear brighter, and putting the right one on the light square makes it appear darker. That's because our brains are always considered the context. It's even more evident in this example. The gray strip in the middle is the same intensity, but our brain tells you it's a gradient. One of my patrons, Loophole, posted this example to our community Discord, and if you look at the metallic trims of the shoulders, compare the ones next to the white and the trims next to the dark shoulder pads. The ones next to the white clearly appear darker. Let's go back to the example of using white to increase contrast. Of course, it's an easy and fast way to get value contrast, but a lot of the time it doesn't make sense or simply doesn't look good. And of course there's always the chalkiness issue. Using the perceived contrast exaggeration of our brains, we can get away by not using white, but putting bright highlights next to dark areas, like I did with the area below the eyelids on Candy-chan, or the lower parts of the lips. Still good contrast without using white, nothing gets desaturated or chalky, and the colors still feel natural. You never should need to use white on materials that don't look good highlighted with white. One way to check if your contrast makes sense is to desaturate your colors and just look at the black and white intensities. On this piece posted by Kessler Miniatures on the community Discord, you can see that most features are separated from each other properly. The readability is good, the non-metallic contrast is maximized, and through perceived contrast the armor plates that don't go up to the white are easily readable too and have good value contrast. Let's look at an example and bring all of this together. I picked another post by a patron from the Discord. This piece is a marine by Josh. The miniature struck me because the greens are great as far as value contrast goes. I would happily pick these colors and put down a value sketch like this. The greens have good saturation, dark shadows and bright highlights. Great. We can improve a few things here. First, adding edge highlights helps with readability. Personally, I would also align some of these highlights differently and add a few more like this. And we can go darker to black even to maximize the contrast and still keep good saturation in the green highlights. Something I also did on this red, for example. While value contrasts help us to create the credibility and realism in miniature painting, other contrasts help us create mood and emotion and allow us to tell a story. Remember, contrast simply means difference, and two different things put next to each other is going to make each individual element more intense. Let's take a brief look at other contrasts. Warm-cold contrast, for example. Warm colors next to cold colors will look even warmer and vice versa. As for complementary contrasts, I don't like to overuse color wheels, but warm-cold contrasts and complementary contrasts definitely work and can help to increase your overall contrast on the miniature. So when choosing colors, keep a color wheel near and take this into account. Keep in mind that complementary contrasts work best if one of the colors is the dominant color, for example like this. Now everything to do with a color wheel beyond these more or less binary contrasts is nice and good in theory, but sometimes hard to implement and takes a lot of planning. Keep that in mind. I'll do a color theory video for one of the next painting basics videos. Saturation contrasts is often done in stylized movies like Sin City, where you have the black and white pitched against color accents of red, yellow and orange. But for example, greens versus gray like on a tempo base like this can also look interesting. That's it for now on contrast. As always, if you have any questions, put them below the video or come to the Discord and let's discuss this. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something and I'll see you next video.